Hey everybody, today we got something a little different. This car belongs to a relation of mine. It's a Hyundai i30 2011. Now the problem with this car is that the low beams are not working. Every other light on the headlight and rear tail light, the whole lot of them are all working, but the low beams, the dim lights are not working. So what they tried to do with this was to change out the main relay for the low beam, and they changed out the light switch, the main light switch at the dash. That did not resolve the issue. So in desperation, they phoned me, and that's where we are. So I decided I would try and help out. Not a car expert by any means, but given that it was likely an electrical fault with it, I said I'd have a look. I'm going to bring you through what I did to try and get this issue resolved. I don't work on cars every day, so rather than just trying to guess how the circuit works, I decided I would go on the internet and try and see if I could find a wiring diagram. I was very fortunate to find this wiring diagram, and I think it's a pretty close representation of what I have in the Hyundai i30 that I'm dealing with. So one thing I try and do with these, if I ever have to look at them, is to try and mark off the lines. Like there's a lot of crossover lines and stuff like that here. So what I try and do is to highlight the relevant parts of the circuit. For example, if you look at the headlamp high relay here, that's for the high beams. We know that's working, so I can completely ignore anything to do with that because that's already working. What I have here is a separate relay, headlamp low relay, which is obviously related to the low beams. So this is the relevant part of the circuit. And what I'm going to do next is mark out all of the lines in the wiring diagram that are related to the low beam circuit. Okay, so starting up at the top up here, hot at all times, that basically just means there's 12 volt present at all times. So that is fed down through a fuse here for protection, back around and up to the coil of the relay. I'm going to mark that section out. Okay, so what we should be seeing here is the 12 volts comes down this wire and up to here. So right here, we should be getting 12 volts. For the purpose of troubleshooting, I'm going to mark that point A. So that line follows through the coil of the relay and down through this IP junction box. I'm not really sure what this is, but that then goes down through the dimmer switch and to ground. So I'm going to mark off that section there because that's also relevant. So basically the way this works is you have 12 volts on one side of the coil, and then by switching this switch on or off, you either ground or break the circuit to ground to the coil here. I'm going to mark this section B right here. So the idea with this is that when you turn the light switch to the dim position, that provides a ground, which means that current passes through the coil. That creates an electromagnet in the coil, and that pulls these two contacts together on this side, which should feed voltage from the 12 volt hot at all times here down to the headlights. But we're going to talk about this section now. On the high current side of the relay, we have hot at all times here, which then feeds down to the contacts in the relay. So this section here is also relevant, and we should be having 12 volts here. I'm going to mark in that section here, and I'm going to call that C, and we should also have 12 volts at this point. And lastly, we have the wiring section that brings the 12 volts down to the headlights. Now there's a lot of crossover wiring here, so once again I'm going to mark out the section. So we should be having the 12 volts coming down here. When this is closed, then we have it feeding down through here. So let me mark out the section that's relevant right here. So the section that's relevant here, it carries the 12 volts down here. It branches off into two sections. The first section goes down to the low beam left-hand headlight. There's a fuse on that left-hand headlight, and it carries down through the headlight to ground. On the other branch, it brings the 12 volts through a separate fuse for the right-hand headlight and down through the low beam on the right-hand headlight to ground. So this is the fourth path that is relevant coming from the relay. I'm going to mark this as point D, and we're going to start our troubleshooting. So I needed to find the low beam relay. This is the fuse box. It's tucked in beside the engine and the battery in the front of the car. So I just need to know which one is the low beam relay. How I found that out was I just went online and I found a quick diagram. There's two types of fuse boxes in this. This is the one that's relevant to me. So I went down. Number 30 is the low beam relay. And here is where it physically is in the box, or this one here, and I was able to just quickly establish that it's this one here that is the relay. Now I said already that we've changed out the relay for a brand new one, so I don't need to test the relay at this point. I will have a follow-up video showing how to test the relay, but I don't need to do that at this point because the relay that I have is brand new. So the first troubleshooting step I thought would be useful would be to take the cover off the relay. If you squeeze those, you can simply pull off the plastic cover, and that shows you the inner workings of the relay itself. There was a lot of clicking when we were changing from high beam to low beam, so I didn't know if that was just another relay or what it was, but by taking off the cover we can actually see if the relay is engaging. So this is my video of what happened when we changed the light switch on the steering wheel from high beam to low beam, high beam to low beam. Just be conscious here that you're hearing the clicking, but the clicking is the high beam going on and off. What you want to watch here is this section right here. What should be happening is when we hit low beam, this should click here. Because when we hit low beam, that should ground the coil, which turns it into a magnet and should pull the contacts together. But watch what happens when we change it to low beam. So as you can see, the contacts were not moving. Now, while I had it there, I decided it would be a good idea. So what we're seeing here is we're looking at this side right here. Let me use my probe. So this contact is not moving over. And the reason for that most likely is that this coil is not being energized. So what I decided to do at this point was to manually engage the contacts here. You can see the two contacts on that right there. So I decided just to get a plastic screwdriver just so that I wouldn't hit off anything, and just put it underneath here, lift it up and make the contacts make a connection manually. When I did that, the headlights came on. So what that told me was that this whole side of the, let me just bring it back out here. So this whole side of the circuit was all working. So what I was doing was manually pushing this here, which brought the 12 volts down, and both of the lights came on and the light on the dash came on. So I established at that point that all of this is working, and the trouble we had was that the relay was either not receiving a 12 volts or not being grounded. So I decided to focus on this part of the circuit then. Having established that there was some difficulty on the coil side, that's the side that I've marked A and B, I just needed to establish which of the two pins here were actually the pins that are connected to the coil, and just see if there was 12 volt on one side. So I pulled out the relay, put it on the table, and I placed my black probe to one of the pins and my red probe to the other pin, and when I measured that, it was 84 ohms. So I knew that that was in or about where the resistance of the coil should be. Just to establish for sure, I placed my probe here and I placed my probe on this pin here, and when I did a resistance check there, it had no reading, which is what I would expect because that is normally an open circuit. So that established for me which was A and B, and when I put the fuse over the fuse board, I could see that those two pins corresponded to these two female spade connectors here. So what I needed to find out then was, where are we getting the hot at all times 12 volts on one of those pins? So how I found that out was I changed my multimeter to volts DC, place my red probe into the spade connector here, and place my black probe to the battery negative post. When I did that, I saw that there was 12 volts there. So I was able to establish at that point that that was point B. Point A. And that then meant that the point across from it was point B, and that made the other two C and D. So the fact that there's 12 volts at point A told me that this circuit, this part of the circuit up to A, was also functioning right. We already established that all of this other side of the circuit is fine, so we've now narrowed down the problem to just this line here. What's meant to happen on this side is that 12 volts is brought to the coil. When we turn on the light switch here, that grounds the coil, which turns it into a magnet and pulls these contacts together. But as you could see from my video, that is not happening. So there is an issue with the grounding of the coil. Once again, we've tried 2 new light switches and that hasn't cured the issue. So we're looking probably at a wiring fault or something to do with this section here. Next, I set about trying to find out where the wire for that came down through the fuse box, down through the IP junction box to the switch, which I thought was going to be really messy because I didn't know how we were going to get it out. Taking out the fuse box looked like a big job that was going to take quite a few hours. And you also risk damaging something else then by, even going at it. However, I asked my colleague to remove the light switch and we hit on a bit of luck at this point, because when he moved the switch, it actually turned the dimmer on. It's this cable right here. So he noticed that when he moved this to a particular position, that the low beam light on the dash came on, and I established that, along with that the 2 low beams actually came on as well. So that is how we worked out that, it was a cabling fault, and my colleague said that he would sort out that issue himself then, just once he knew what the issue was. So something a little different today. That's how we troubleshoot a wiring diagram for, an automotive issue. If people like these, I might do a few more of them. But for the moment, like and subscribe, and please leave any feedback you have, positive or negative, down below, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you very much.